We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's September 26th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yoon, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Nal Song. Good morning. And Park Ki-hoon.
Happy to be here.
All right. Now, both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. The Asian Games in Hangzhou, China is underway, and this particular Chinese athlete went viral. It's Wang Xun, a Chinese swimmer who recently broke the 200 meters individual medley record and swept gold for China. Besides his performance, though, netizens, particularly those in Korea, raved over his good looks. Many said he had handsome features resembling a K-pop idol. And a few days ago, the New York Times highlighted a South Korean senior welfare policy that took effect since 1984. That's allowing seniors aged 65 and up to ride the subway for free. The article took note of how 15% of all Seoul Metro users per year are aged 65 and up. These seniors ride the subway for free, especially during the hot summer when they want to avoid the heat. And from Monday, all medical institutions in South Korea were required to install and operate CCTVs in the operating room. Hospitals must store recorded videos for at least 30 days, and this is to prevent any possible abuse or illicit activity against patients under anesthesia. And the revision was approved by the National Assembly in 2021 following a series of medical incidents where unqualified staff entered the surgery and medical staff were found sexually harassing patients under anesthesia. And medical institutes that violate the latest policy can be fined up to $3,700. Now, the latest measure has drawn arguments from hospitals and patients. Hospitals and medical groups said the latest measure undermines trust in doctors and violates patients' privacy. Patients groups and bereaved family members of medical accident victims, on the other hand, asked for tighter clauses. They've asked that exceptions be made narrower and that videos be archived for at least 90 days, considering the time needed to initiate legal proceedings once disputes arise. Now, medical institutions can still refuse to record the surgery if there's an emergency or natural disaster, and when video monitoring seems to disturb surgeries or medical residents training. Now, here in the studio, what do you think about the latest revision, and where do you stand on this debate, Ki-hoon?
I think surgery rooms is a space for doctors to practice their medical expertise with just one objective: to successfully finish the operation without any accidents. And having a CCTV look down on them would be like the same feeling as working in an office with a CCTV over the top of every single desk.
Right.
And I don't think I'll feel comfortable actually working with a CCTV on top of my head. And I think doctors feel the same way right now, including the medical staff as well. So the current regulation states that patients need to request for the recording of the CCTV when they actually sign the surgery consent form. And so far, not many patients have actually requested for the recording. So I think it's really up to the patients to be a bit more diligent, to be legally protected in case of any medical accidents that do happen. But I think, it raised a question to me, if you don't really trust your doctor, nor the hospital, who are you going to trust when you are in need of a big surgery?
That is true. But then I would like to play the devil's advocate here. A lot of patients and the families of patients were shocked because, as you mentioned, we should be trusting doctors, but there were certain cases where they abused that power and that trusting relationship where we saw some sexual harassment happening or illicit activity when they were drugged down with anesthesia, right? So where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to agree with you on that because Ki-hoon was mentioning that this is a space for their expertise, and so far there have been some cases where they were doing things outside of their expertise. And, it's saying that we're undermining the trust for doctors, but some of them have violated our trust. But like we were mentioning, they can request for it, but also the hospital can refuse under emergencies and certain cases. So I think this is the step towards the right direction in that people can have the option to do so, but I can see how this could be a lot of pressure on the doctors.
Right, and once again, to play the devil's advocate for hospitals too, in emergency situations when it's all about life and death, they should have that authority.
Yeah, and sometimes there's, medical people who sue doctors for certain things, and perhaps it can help them out someday.
Right, so we'll have to see where this measure and revision goes from now on. And that was our news feed for this Tuesday. Let's now change gears to our main discussion of the day. pay. One thing that's making the lives of those in their 20s and 30s in Korea difficult is the amount of debt they have to pay off. Take a look at the screen to find out more.
Over the past 3 years, loans for those in their 30s and under surged by nearly 30%. A commercial bank official analyzed that the younger generation are easily prone to having much debt because they're either students or are non-regular workers. With weak income streams and record inflation, it's hard for youngsters to pay for a roof over their head or go on with their daily lives. Also, since the pandemic, asset prices such as real estate have soared, which all played a part in adding to young people's financial burdens.
As much as it's getting harder for young people to pay back their debt, some are going to the extremes of selling their own or their parents' valuables at pawn shops. So now, could you walk us through what exactly are they selling there?
Right. So, I mean, because of the economy and the inflation, along with the struggling job market, a lot of people have been seeking the pawn shops because they need cash, right? And we consider this to be a very old and almost an outdated thing, as loans and usage of credit cards have increased and they've kind of been pushed out of the spotlight. But with the recent boom of the younger generation seeking them, it's kind of like this golden new age for them. And you can actually call them. They have, you know, Kakao Messenger, so you can actually ask them about how much things could potentially cost. And there's actually no pressure of the screening that you have to go through when you go through the bank with loans, so there's kind of like all this advantage.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that pawn shops in Korea have evolved with the advent of technology. Kyun, could you add on why and how are Korean millennials and Gen Z using these pawn shops?
You know, many young people sell electronic devices from their smartphones, like digital cameras, and even laptops to get their hands on liquid quick cash from these pawn shops. And there are even so-called IT pawn shops that only receive these kind of electronic goods. I think it's become very popular among the 20s, people in their 20s and 30s because of its easy accessibility. But they must keep in mind that they need to pay back the loan with interest on top in a very short amount of time. If not, they can, I guess, just, you know, not be able to redeem their items. And having that feeling of, you know, you have to pay back money in a short amount of time, I think that will cause extra stress. But Naya will explain a bit later on this, but the money they borrow is used for regular expenses in need of urgent payment. Like, for example, like their school fees, tuition fees, and even paying back, you know, housing debt, and even rent, monthly rent as well. So I think being in that kind of dire situation will be very stressing, and I don't really want to see myself going to the pawn shop, you know, selling my goods.
But I almost feel like I've kind of done it like through the online secondhand shops in that way by selling it kind of. So I think it's the same theory, but in like a pawn shop
That's a really
way.
good point. Though you didn't go to a traditional pawn shop.
Yeah, it's kind of a pawn shop.
Yeah,
I'll just never get it back.
And it all comes down to our generation just being burdened with so much debt. So why don't we look at why Koreans in their 20s and 30s are under so much debt?
Right, so I've prepared a visual. Let's look at the screen. So these are the different areas that people are indebted in. So the first one is college tuition, student loan, and this took up 31.7%. And like Hyun was mentioning, the rent and deposit fee for the housing, it's quite large, is 25.3%. And living costs, kind of emergency funds, they needed the hard cash, it's 20.2%. And then mortgage, this is the case when people buy the houses and they have to pay back a monthly interest and the original sum. And lastly, self-development is 9%. This is the things that you invest in yourself to kind of improve. And according to a survey for people in their 20s and 30s, 3 out of 10 Koreans had around $7,500 worth of loans by the time they graduated. And this year was the highest percentage delayed in the interest payments in 10 years. So 15% of the people who were indebted were late on their payments. It's kind of serious.
It's very serious, and I think COVID-19 really exacerbated it, right, amongst our generation.
Exactly. When the pandemic broke out, the world suffered, you know, economic recession, and unfortunately, the younger generation were impacted and affected the most. And because we were the most vulnerable age group, and I think, you know, loss of job opportunities led to many youngsters taking a loan and investing their loan or debt into cryptocurrency, even stocks. I mean, but we have to keep in mind that there is a fine line between investment and gambling.
Yes.
And I think many chose the gambling, and they wanted quick cash in return in a short amount of time. But it really only made them into like a situation where they had to pay back more debt. And right now they're in a more, I guess, serious situation. So I think other than that, I think inflation just made matters worse. So I think for youngsters, not having the capability of being financially, I guess, in a good situation, I think. And plus, if we don't receive help from our parents, I think we're the ones who suffer the most right now. And that's why we're seeing a lot of youngsters going to pawn shops. And I mean, it's not a good sign, obviously.
It's not a good sign. And whenever we talk about economic issues, though it's a dire message, I think we repeatedly say living costs are way too high. Record inflation is making it difficult. Employment doesn't seem to be so easy. That's why a lot of youngsters don't get like regular jobs, a 9-to-6 office job with health insurance. They choose non-regular jobs, which sometimes aren't the best to pay off their debts. And it's really making it difficult for us to live on day by day, which, as you mentioned, some people choose to go gambling or pawn shops where you can get immediate liquid cash. Now, let's find out if young people in other parts of the world are also suffering with high debt rates as much as here in Korea. We asked our viewers to tell us how it is in their respective countries. Take a look at the screen. Terrace Bell said, I'm around 60,000 in debt. 90% of this comes from student loans. Nath said, I have 28,000 in debt under monthly pay for my Honda Accord X 2023, but I lost 17,000 due to repairs for my old car before trading it away. How849 said, we live in a debt society. Money is made from debt. House, school loan, graduate studies, rotating credit cards, personal credit line, or equity loan to pay off vehicles or build a new home. So wherever you go, I think a lot of people do suffer from debt, and it's all having to do with living costs and even student loans, right? And experts are reiterating the importance of government programs to help out young people in debt. So could you guys introduce some policies that are taking place right now?
So there was this thing called the Rent Support Project where the government would pay about 200,000 Korean won, which is approximately around $150 per month. For 12 months straight, they would support you. And many people were actually interested, but the criteria and the qualifications for this supporting thing was quite specific, and so in reality not very many people were able to benefit from this. And so people are saying more than this, there should be more actual housing, so that the number of housing should increase so that young adults can actually afford the housing by working a regular job.
That would take a lot of burden off our generation because a lot of the money that we are trying to save up actually is trying to go into housing, right? Ki-hoon, would you like to add on how the Korean government is trying to help?
Yeah, the government works with banks to help young adults by providing installment savings products with high interest. But just like what Niall said, like the rent support projects, these conditions are too specific and they only relate to only a few people. And for those who actually start saving up, they actually end up terminating in the middle because of, high living costs and things like that. So I think we need to really dig down deep into the actual headwinds that slow down the country's future. The main cause being obviously the low birth rate, aging society. And it's funny how people in their 20s and 30s are being targeted the most and being supported the least from other people. So I think the government, even the big companies and the older generation really need to look closely into solving these kind of problems and looking deep down into the roots, and instead of playing the blaming game, saying, hey, you guys are too naive, too young, irresponsible, you have it easy, back in my day, we used to work harder than you guys, so it's your fault for not getting married, not being able to make enough money to, support your own family and even owning a house. So, things have changed, but I think we should all work harmoniously to really find the actual problem and work towards building a better future, heading towards the right direction.
Right, because it's not only an individual problem, it's a collective societal problem that will and affect the future generation and even us. So to find out more what needs to be done, let's include a sociology expert in our discussion right after this. can we solve Korea's growing youth debt problem? Let's find out by including a sociology professor from Chungang University in Seoul. It's Professor Seo Chan. Welcome, Professor Seo.
Hello, Professor.
Hello, thank you for having me. It is great to watch your great conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we can't wait to engage you in our interesting conversation. Now, Professor Seo, apart from the reasons we've mentioned so far, why do you think Korea has such a high youth debt rate? And why are a lot of people from our generation struggling with so much debt compared to either our parents' or grandparents' generation?
As you mentioned, we are living in this age of inflation, especially after the COVID-19. But I want to identify two reasons why young people are suffering. The first one would obviously be the increasing housing and rent rate, rent price. So as the figure shows, 40% of those debt is moving to students' rent or mortgage. And just think about 1990s. Like I went back to 1997 and looked into the well-known Eunma apartment in Gangnam area. The price was only 200 million. Now it is 2,000 million. So there was a 10 times increase in housing. But this increasing housing price is a global phenomenon, as you mentioned. And I have to also identify one important factor, which is this hyper-centralization towards Seoul. There are so many decent jobs only in Seoul, and the prestigious universities are mostly in Seoul. So for young people who are, let's say, living in San Francisco in California, they have options to move to Texas or Utah or other places. Same for London, people living in London or Toronto, they go to Ottawa. People living in Seoul, young people, they have no option to move to other areas. So they are forced to live in Seoul even when their hometown is far from there. And as ordinary citizens, it's almost impossible to save their money or ways to buy housing.
So let me ask the second question. Why does this issue require so much attention and actually immediate action? And what does a high youth debt rate mean for the economy and the society in the long run, in the future?
Yes, it would be like increasing debt means lower consumption. This is an issue in our economy. People obviously buy less. And people say Korean economy is export-based. But if you look into data, still over 50% of the GDP is coming from domestic markets. So lower consumption really matters. And as Ki-yoon mentioned previously, the low birth rate is an issue. Those who suffer the most are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who have to make the decision of having babies or not. And yes, the impact of low fertility rate is slightly exaggerated, but still no one could deny the negative outcome of low birth rate toward our society and our economy.
Professor Seo, how would you evaluate the government's current efforts to bring debt rates down, and what needs more work, in your opinion?
Yeah. The government, especially the financial institution, is not increasing the interest rate, I mean the benchmark interest rate, to deal with this rising household debt. But because the government is not increasing interest rate, they are not properly dealing with inflation, which leads to increasing household debt as well. So the government is actually in a dilemmatic situation. And as a young person, it is actually very hard to get loans from banks. It is even hard for someone like me who is in a permanent position. So they are forced to use non-banking financial institutions, so they have to pay more interest. I want to add one more angle and focus on wage. The government did corporate tax cut for corporations for our economy, but they aren't doing much for our employees. They are not cutting taxes for earned income tax rate, for example. So because of inflation and because of this constant wage and rising housing prices, young people are in trouble. They have to be forced to get debt from non-banking institutions. And I don't think the government is properly dealing with this issue, but at the same time, I don't think any government can easily deal with.
True.
Absolutely.
Because, Professor, as you mentioned, the only reason why it's so difficult for them, there's so many factors that they have to consider, and it's not something just confined here to Korea. I think it's definitely a global concept. So we'll have to keep an eye on what the regulations are, how the benchmark interest rate will affect us from now on. But until then, thank you so much for sharing your insight on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir.
All right, and now I would like to wrap up our discussion by asking you guys the last question. What would you guys like to see? This is a difficult problem that we won't be easily able to solve in the near future. But still, let's take on a positive note. What do you guys like to see be happening to our generation, specifically those struggling with debt?
Well, I mean, we just asked the professor, but even he's saying it's such a complex matter that we can't just throw around a simple answer. But to give a simple answer, we need more job opportunities. There needs to be more jobs and easier access to, lower interest rate loans so that we don't go to pawn shops and sell all our old electronics that we'll probably never get back.
Or online secondhand shops.
Yeah, and there's lots of even some illegal ways to do things. So I really think that's an issue, and the housing that we mentioned, having more housing is key.
Take it from us, we're the new generation.
Yes, take it from us.
Ki-hoon?
Just like economic recession, inflation, I think being in debt is sometimes inevitable, and it can happen to anyone. So I just think that young people growing up, even as students, need to be a bit more educated in how they earn their money and how they invest their money. Because it's a pity to see a lot of young students, especially here in Korea, they're just not taught. They're just raised, telling them just study. Study all your school lives to get into a prestigious university and then start your career from there. But then that could be a little too late. We don't learn other factors in life that actually matter the most, like when we experience inflation, how are we going to deal with it? We've got to learn these kind of things to actually really fight these kind of difficult situations. So I just think that, earning money is great, but knowing how to save up money is also as important.
That's a very good point, Q. And I think we mentioned on our episode when we talked about gambling, the reason why our generation is so susceptible, though, is the lack of education and these rumors say, I heard this person earned a lot of money this way, saved up this way.
We're kind of the YOLO generation, the you only live once. So I really think we need to educate people in the economics area about YOLO. Like, it's not YOLO.
Exactly. While we will be hoping for the government to implement better policies, maybe on our front, we can try by better educating ourselves. In the meantime, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Nal Song.
No problem.
And Park Ki-hoon.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.